So let's talk about some chemical mediators. And the first terms you want to get familiar with are the cytokines. So cytokines is like the umbrella term that talks about interleukins, TNF, interferons. And then the next thing we look at are kind of the purpose for the interleukins, tumor necrosis factors and interferons. And like I said, there are a lot of them out there, so you don't have to memorize all of them. But I do want you to kind of be familiar with the primary cells that release them and then what their main purpose is. So we'll look at the interleukins first. And you can see here are the cytokines. You can see all these different interleukins and their purposes. So if you want defense structures, you can look. The TNF is great for defense. So interferons, great for defense. If you're looking for something that helps stimulate cell differentiation, like growth of proliferation of white blood cells, look at all these ILs. So interleukin 1, interleukin 2, interleukin 4, interleukin 5. Those all stimulate other white blood cells to replicate. All right, so anyway, the interleukins, primarily made by the macrophage and the lymphocytes. So you want to have that down somewhere. The macrophage and the lymphocytes. The reason they release them is because they've detected a pathogen or some other inflammatory product. So they've detected there's something wrong in the environment. They kick out the interleukins, and the interleukins usually stimulate other white blood cells to come to the area or proliferation of other white blood cells. And it's the macrophage and the lymphocytes that primarily do that. And then tumor necrosis factor, usually you hear it called TNF alpha or tumor necrosis factor alpha, but it's also secreted by macrophages. So primarily by the macrophage. It's released because of those PAMPs. So the PAMP stimulates a toll-like receptor to be fired, and then poof, you start releasing TNF alpha, tumor necrosis factor. Right? So your body has a feeling there's some kind of bacteria in it and it's trying to fight it off. And the next ones are interferons. And interferons are primarily released by virally infected cells. So if a cell in your body has been infected by a virus and it knows it, if it detects that a virus is present, it goes, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm infected. I'm not going to get rid of this virus, so I better warn the neighbors. And it starts dumping this interferon in the neighborhood, and it tells all the neighboring cells, be careful because there's a virus in the neighborhood. Lock the doors, bar the windows, don't let it in. So here's an example of interferon. But with interferon, this cell was infected by a virus. It detects the virus, and then it starts releasing interferon. This cell knows it's going to die. It knows it's committed. So it's going to release the interferon. It's going to try and not let the virus out. In fact, it's going to go through cell suicide called what? Apoptosis. It's going to go through apoptosis. It's going to try and, in a nice, orderly fashion, kill itself with the virus in it and keep it contained. But in the meantime, it's releasing these interferon molecules, and they're going outside, going to the neighboring cell, and telling the neighbor cell, hey, there's a virus present. This cell starts making an antiviral protein. So it's kind of like making these extra defenses. It's rerouting all of its resources to making these antivirals. Now if the virus comes over here and tries to infect this cell, once the virus gets in, the cell is waiting for it. And once it gets in, the cell attacks that, kills the virus, and destroys it, and now the cell's safe. That's what an interferon does. Right. So just a little bit more detail on the TNF. So tumor necrosis alpha, primarily by the macrophage, and it helps mediate inflammation. So it triggers an inflammatory response. It helps drive the white blood cells to that area, so chemotaxis. And then another interesting thing is it causes insulin resistance. So the more of this TNF you have out there, the more you look like you're diabetic. You can't regulate sugars properly. But if it's an infection situation, it's a good thing. It's providing energy for all of your white blood cells to attack the infector. And this TNF alpha goes to the liver and releases liver enzymes that help you fight infection too. TNF alpha is one of the contributors to cachexia. So when we talked about cancers and muscle wasting and cachexia, TNF alpha is actually one of the chemical contributors to this. Oh, and TNF alpha can also stimulate fever. I think I mentioned that earlier, but it's considered an endogenous pyrogen. Right, next are the interleukins, and interleukin 1 is kind of the one I want to focus on because you'll hear about this a lot. But interleukin 1 is actually a pro-inflammatory cytokine, so it stimulates inflammation. I'm saying number 1 specifically because some of the interleukins are actually anti-inflammatory, like number 10 is anti-inflammatory. But 1's the one you want to focus on because 1's going to be released primarily by macrophage and lymphocytes, like I already mentioned. Right? It stimulates coagulation, it stimulates clotting. It attracts more white blood cells to the area, and it also helps increase the temperature of that tissue in the area too. So it's trying to cook out the bacteria. And then just like TNF-alpha, it stimulates more liver enzyme release. And we'll talk about those liver enzymes in just a bit. So I've given you 3 different cytokines: interferons, TNF-alpha, and interleukins. When you're looking at this passageway, I'm kind of building up one piece at a time. We talked about microbial pathogens, how they stimulate PAMPs, or stimulate your body because they have the PAMPs on the surface. And then here we're talking about how the leukocytes are stimulated. We talked about phagocytosis. We've talked about how cytokines are released. I talked about some of the organs cytokines are affecting. And then you can see the final effects. We talked about fever a little bit. We talked about neutropenia, where you're making more neutrophils because of an infection. So we talked about white blood cells being recruited into the endothelial factors or endothelial cells and tissues. So lots of things that are going on. And we're going to keep building on it. So now let's tackle another question. So question number 4 is, what is hypercytokinemia? I mean, you can probably figure out just by looking at the word what it is. But what else is it called? And this is interesting because this uses a feedback loop. Those cytokines are really good, but what if you get too many cytokines in the blood? What do they call it? So you can Google it, look it up in your book. What are the typical symptoms? This is kind of like going back to endocrine system. If you know the effects of the cytokines and you have too many, you can just say the effects are amplified. What are those amplified effects, though? And then this is interesting because when you have hypercytokinemia, what is the feedback loop that's turned on? So I know you've heard of feedback loops before. What feedback loop gets turned on during hypercytokinemia? And is that dangerous or not? So I'm going to let you pause and look those up. Next, acute versus chronic. So winding down. This is actually going to be a slightly longer video, but acute versus chronic. So acute, its focus is preventing spread and restoring the healing. It's bringing it back to its natural state. Where in chronic, things that last longer than 2 weeks, it's also trying to prevent spread, but it's actually adapting and remodeling the tissue into a new way. So restorative healing is bringing it back to the original condition it was in before, where adaptive is changing the tissue to overcome the illness. Kind of like when we talked about adaptive cells. So you can have local and systemic infections. And locally, you already know all the symptoms. Redness, swelling, heat, pain, loss of function. Those are all typical. When it moves systemically, you also know some of those symptoms. Fever stimulates more white blood cells to be produced. So leukocytosis is what that's called. Stimulates the liver to start producing proteins like C-reactive proteins. Fibrinogen to help clot up the blood. It actually makes things called amyloids. And when we get into the brain, we'll talk about amyloid plaques in the brain causing Alzheimer's disease. So it can make these amyloids, and they're actually looking and think that chronic inflammation may be linked to Alzheimer's disease. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the brain. So here, just when you're comparing locally versus systemic, there are the different effects. And then you want to look at acute versus chronic. And systemic chronic is a huge issue. Local chronic, usually you get like things called granulomas, or dense tissue will build up in that area. When you're looking at long-term chronic effects, 2 weeks or longer, then you're looking at some bigger problems. Right? So like I said before, with chronic situations like obesity, obesity stimulates inflammation. The longer that you have this inflammatory response going on, the more your own body is like on this defense fence. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's like on the watch. So it's on high alert. It's almost like you being stressed out all the time and on edge. Well, your immune system's like that all the time. So chronic inflammation, chronic obesity can actually cause issues with your inflammatory system. Other infective agents, kind of like TB, mycobacteria. So these things, they actually have kind of a waxy surface on them. They're hard for the immune system to get a hold of. So TB is actually a form of mycobacteria. So a waxy coat. What's interesting about TB is it hides inside of macrophage. So it hides inside of them and drives them around like they're a tank. So it's hard for your immune system to get rid of TB because it hides inside the immune system. It's kind of like HIV. It's the same idea. Right? So other things like leprosy, syphilis, all of these things, they like to hide in macrophage. They hide in your immune system, so they're hard to get rid of. So they become chronic. That's why when you've had TB, you can still spread TB because TB can be hiding in your system for decades and you didn't even know it. So what's interesting is that sometimes what your body will do to try and isolate off, if it knows these things are in the area but can't kill it, it'll isolate it. So after a few weeks, you may start forming this thing called a granuloma, and I talked about this slightly before, but now I'll talk about it a little bit better. So let's say you have some kind of infective agent in here that you can't get rid of. Your body can't clear it for whatever reason. So then it starts bringing in the fibroblasts, and the fibroblasts will actually build a wall all the way around this, and it's called a granuloma. So that's what a granuloma is. The problem with granulomas is that your immune system still knows it's there, so occasionally it'll keep sending things in and attacking it. And this story, my brother, when we were kids, he accidentally fell down when we were playing along the river, fishing and stuff. I swear I didn't push him. I kind of swear. Anyway, but he fell down, he got a stick lodged in his leg. And so we broke the stick off and took him back to our parents, and they took him to the doctor, and they just stitched it up. They didn't know the stick was there. So nobody knew the stick was there because we had broken it off and we thought we got it all, but it was a soaked stick full of, bacteria, and it was soggy and easy to break, so there was still some left in. And over the next several years, he kept getting really bad fevers, and then he'd have convulsions. The fevers would get so intense he'd get convulsions. And so years after that, he accidentally fell down again and broke his leg. I'm feeling real guilty here. But anyway, so he accidentally fell down. And when they did an x-ray, they looked and they saw this granuloma from where the stick had gone on his leg before. His body had put a wall up around the piece of wood, but that bacteria was still growing in here. And occasionally the bacteria would seep out a little bit, and his immune system would go crazy. It'd start triggering this inflammatory response, start triggering fever. He'd get so hot, he'd go into convulsions. So when they fixed his leg, when they set his leg, they went and they removed that granuloma with all that stick, and he never had another convulsion again because of it. So it's amazing the things that your immune system does. But a granuloma is just a characteristic of when your body can't fight it and kill it completely, it isolates it off or blocks it off. And your body will do the same thing. Like when we're talking about LDLs, or low-density lipoproteins. Those low-density lipoproteins get stuck in the wall of your blood vessel, and then basically a granuloma forms around it. So it starts accumulating, and we call that atherosclerosis. You might get well, remember insulin resistance when we were talking about TNF-alpha? It causes insulin resistance or insulin decline. It may look like you have diabetes, so it might look like you have type 2 diabetes. You have this constant inflammation. So obesity can trigger all of these things over and over again. Right? It can cause amyloid plaques that are associated with inflammation, Alzheimer's disease. It can cause mutations because of the inflammatory response. When we talk about Helicobacter pylori, it can cause mutations, can cause cancers. So you can see things in pathophysiology and physiology aren't always straightforward. You have to think of all the possible options. One problem, obesity, can cause chronic inflammation and cause this whole slew of different problems in your body. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in this section are protein cascades, and there are 3 of them you have to know. So the main 3 protein systems are the complement, coagulation, and the kinin systems. So the complement cascade system, complement is an effective fighting system. It's like a chain of dominoes. There's several of them. And their main purpose is to try and destroy pathogens. You get an invader, the complement attacks it, or it holds it down so that the rest of your immune system can attack it. The second one is the coagulation system, and you may call it the clotting system. What its whole purpose is to make this like fibrinous meshwork to try and trap the blood and keep you from bleeding to death. Right? So it tries to spread the infection, or prevent the spread of infection too. And that's what the coagulation is there for. And then the kinin system, the last one, it's primarily there as vasoactive. So bradykinin is going to be the key chemical, and we'll talk about it in 2 slides from now. But anyway, it's vasoactive. It causes blood vessel dilation and smooth vessel contraction. So it works a lot like histamine does. Right? One key with all 3 of these are circulating in their body all the time. They're just inactive. So they're called proenzymes. They're not active. Pro means before. So they're already floating, but when you turn one on, they cause this cascade effect or this domino effect and just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's one that triggers another, which triggers another, which triggers another, but it's getting bigger at the same time, so it's kind of like snowballing like this and dominoing at the same time. Let me show you. Okay, so we'll talk about this first one. And I put this over here, and you don't have to memorize the whole cascade. In fact, I'll point out the significant parts, so don't sweat it. But you have all of these inactive enzymes. They're all floating around your blood all the time. When you trigger the first one, though, it's like flipping the first domino, and then go tink, 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 tink. So you trigger the first part of this, and it's a chain reaction all the way down. Right? So sequential. And there are going to be 3 parts of the complement cascade, and we'll talk about the classic, the lectin, and the alternative pathways. So here they are. The classical pathway, there are a couple of characteristics that help distinguish these pathways. The classic pathway is actually part of the adaptive immunity. It needs an antigen-antibody complex, which we'll talk about in the next section. But an antibody, there's little things that float through your system to help protect you. If you remember learning about the Rh factor, when you had antibodies in your system that attack certain types of red blood cells, it's the same concept. So it's triggered because of these antibodies. It's a learned experience that triggers this classic pathway. The alternative pathway is innate, which means it's not learned, it's just born with you. And it's spontaneously activated when it's exposed to a pathogen. So it sees a pathogen and then boom, 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 starts turning on. It detects that pattern on the pathogen and says, hey, you don't belong here, and tries to attack it. And the last one's the lectin pathway. And this is the mannose binding pathway. Mannose is a sugar that's on the surface of bacteria. So it recognizes that sugar. It doesn't matter what the bacteria is. When it recognizes the sugar, it starts turning on this cascade to try and kill that bacteria. So here you can see different pathways. And the pathway, it's going to do a couple things. It's going to try and directly kill the invader, but it's also going to stimulate an inflammatory response. It's going to try and turn up things like mast cells. It's going to attract white blood cells to the area. So it works as a chemoattractant. Right? It's also going to stick all over the bacteria. So if it can't directly kill the bacteria, it sticks to it. I heard one time that this complement is like buttering the bacteria so it's more delicious to white blood cells. So it just makes the white blood cells attracted to it. The white blood cells come along and then they wrap themselves around and eat the bacteria. And then the next thing is the direct attack. It can actually punch holes in the surface of bacteria. So let me go back one slide here. You can see these pathways. It's complex, lots of dominoes. But the key here is that no matter which of those 3 pathways gets turned on, they all come together and merge at the same. So once they get down here at this chemical C3, all 3 of them have C3 in common. So C3 gets turned on. C3 is a proenzyme. It breaks apart, splits apart, causes a little bit more of a chain reaction. So you can see C3 activates C5, C5 activates C6, 7, 8, and then C9 turns on. The C9 is also another cool one. So C3 is common to all 3 pathways. C9 creates this thing called a membrane attack complex, where the pieces of C9 will go poke, 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 and they create a hole. Creates a hole right in the surface of the bacteria. So now this water-type bacteria has a hole in it. What's going to happen to the water? It's going to lyse the cell. Yeah, the cell breaks apart. So it basically punches a hole. The membrane attack complex punches a hole in the invader. So here's just another picture showing it. So like I said before, all paths come together at C3. When C3 is turned on, it tries to attack and punch a hole right in the surface of that cell, and then the water comes out and it lyses the cell. So here's another example. C3 turns on the pathway. You can see the C9 is going to come in, and C9 punches a hole here, another one, another one, another one, until it finally punches a complete hole and then lyses the cell. So all pathways turn on this thing called membrane attack complex. The pathways also opsonize, and opsonize just means that it makes it more susceptible to an attack. Butters the bacteria so that other cells can attack it. Because some of these bacteria are too big. It's hard for the complement to attack it and kill it. So the white blood cells come in and try and do it for it. They stimulate chemotaxis, so they attract other cells to the area. They say, hey, white blood cells, there's an invader over here. Come clean it up, eat it, get rid of it, whatever you have to do. And then some trigger the inflammatory response. So some will trigger this mast cell to degranulate, releasing histamine, causing inflammation, swelling, redness, pain, loss of function. So you know those things. That's complement, right? Complement basically works with all the different cells. And this is a repeat. So I already talked about opsonization, chemotaxis, inflammation, lysis. Here's just the definitions. Here you can see just categories again. So with the innate immunity, opsonization doesn't matter what it is. Tries to lyse it, doesn't matter what it is. Attracts white blood cells, no matter what it is, causes inflammation regardless, and activates other cells. Okay? It helps you dispose of. Basically, It triggers these cells that shouldn't be there to go through apoptosis and die, or help clean up the apoptotic cells. And then adaptive immunity works with the antibodies, so it's specific, which we're just about to get into on the next video. Next cascade is called coagulation cascade, and of course, this is blood clotting. There are actually 13 factors. They're numbered 1 through 13, but there are in reality only 11 real factors. Factor number 4 is actually just calcium. And number 6, they thought it was a factor, but then they said, it's not, so they took it back. So now number 6, actually, there is no factor number 6, but we labeled them 1 through 13. So there are really only 11 factors, and calcium is one of those factors. You don't have to memorize them, and they're not in a specialized order, so you can see that they kind of jump around in number. They were actually named in the order they were discovered. But here you can see the initiation, and it's a domino effect, just like the last cascade. Tick, 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 clot. So it's a pathway. So when you look, the main component of this pathway that you want to get familiar with is something called fibrin. Fibrinogen is in your bloodstream all the time. It's inactive. Ogen means it's inactive. Right? When it's activated, fibrin causes clumping. It causes clotting. It causes basically this web meshwork to catch red blood cells and platelets to stick them together. Right? So that's the main pathway. You probably remember when we were talking about the genetic factors, we talked about hemophilia. Do you remember which factor hemophilia was? So it was hemophilia A was the one we talked about before. And it's autosome recessive, and it was because of factor number 8. So factor number 8, hemophilia A. It's the most common type of hemophilia. So, and then next, the kinin system. So it's the Kinin-kallikrein system, but we just call it the kinin system, and bradykinin was the main chemical in it. So you can see the different factors or pathways. So, over here. There we go. So you have the prefactors or profactors that turn on the kininogens, which was a prefactor, and it turns on bradykinin. Bradykinin causes vasodilation, smooth muscle constriction. It causes vascular leakage, so edema in that area, and it also causes localized pain. So it's going to try and attract other factors too. You can see bradykinin has lots of effect. Some good effects, some bad effects. You don't have to remember all of them right now. We've already talked about some of these things, but bradykinin is involved in inflammation. So you're going to see things like edema. You're going to see runny nose, rhinitis. You're going to see asthma, because it's going to help stimulate other things like histamine. Right? So these are all the bad, painful, uncomfortable situations. You can also see that bradykinin causes some good things too, like it's antihypertensive. It causes vasodilation. It helps your blood pressure relax a little bit. Right? So it does some good things. All right. And then I kind of, on the last slide up here, this part that talks about Hagman's factor. If you look at all three of those cascades that we've talked about, the complement, the clotting, the kinin system, the one common place that they converge is actually Hagman factor. So Hagman is factor number 12 when you're looking at the clotting cascade, but interacts with the others. So all of these kind of revolve around inflammation, affecting the blood flow, the blood vessel diameter, affecting white blood cells to come into the area. So they all kind of work together and they revolve around that factor 12. But what's interesting is if you have a factor 12 deficiency, then it's typically asymptomatic. It doesn't cause you not to be able to clot. In fact, it does the opposite. Sometimes it prevents the clots from breaking down efficiently. So people sometimes get deep vein thrombosis where they build up clots in their deep veins that can break free and cause problems. So those are the three main cascades. And again, here's kind of like a checkpoint slide so you can go back and look at some of the factors we've talked about. So you can look at them on a cellular level, you can look at them on the liver level. So at a cellular level, when you're releasing things, you release things like histamine, serotonin, lysozymes to attack the invader. Right? You can see the main sources that are here. You can see things you make from scratch. So these are granules. Okay? These are made from scratch, like prostaglandins, leukotrienes, nitric oxide, cytokines. And then the liver, when it's stimulated, releases proteins into the blood. So it helps release complement, helps activate complement. So you can see these complement factors. There's your C3 and C9 again, the major or important factors. And then that Hagman factor, so factor 12. Right. Last question. So Homework number 5, what role does calcium have in the coagulation cascade? So just Google it. Calcium and coagulation, and it'll explain its process. So calcium is important for more than giving you strong bones. It's important for more than just helping you activate neurons or release neurotransmitters. It has a lot of roles in the body. It's a really important chemical. Remember, it affects your heart. It affects your blood clotting. And then look up what role vitamin K has in coagulation cascade too. So it has an active role. What's its role? And that's it. See you on the next video.